$50. That's all Marilyn Monroe received for the photographs that would nearly destroy her career 3 years later. In 1949, Norma Jeane Dougherty, not yet the Marilyn the world would know, was a 23-year-old struggling actress who hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Her rent was 2 months overdue. Her rusty blue Ford coupe had been repossessed the previous week. When photographer Tom Kelley called, offering $50 for an artistic nude session, she didn't hesitate because she couldn't afford to. She'd modeled for Kelley before, always clothed, always professional. He promised the photos would be tasteful, anonymous, used only for calendars sold in gas stations and barbershops. Nobody would ever know it was her. On a May evening, she arrived at his studio on Northwestern Avenue, hung her cheap cotton dress on a hook, and posed naked on red velvet for 2 hours while Kelley's camera clicked. She signed the release form Mona Monroe and left with two 20s and a $10 bill that paid for groceries and bought her another week in her dingy apartment. 3 years later, when those photographs surfaced and threatened to end her career, that desperate moment of hunger and hope would become the scandal that changed Hollywood forever. Before we continue with this story, please subscribe to stay updated on more untold Hollywood stories. The Hollywood that Norma Jeane inhabited in 1949 was a brutal machine that consumed young women and rarely spit them back out intact. She'd been dropped by 20th Century Fox the previous year after her option wasn't renewed, a polite industry term for being told you weren't good enough. Columbia Pictures had signed her briefly, then let her go. She was living on unemployment checks that barely covered the cheapest room she could find, eating crackers and canned soup when she could afford it, sometimes going to bed hungry when she couldn't. The modeling work that had sustained her before her brief studio contracts had mostly dried up. She was 23 years old, which in Hollywood's calculation was already approaching the dangerous age where a woman's value began its inevitable decline. She watched other girls in her acting classes land small roles, bit parts, anything that kept them visible while she faded into the anonymous mass of blonde hopefuls who arrived in Los Angeles every single day with dreams that the city methodically dismantled. The telephone call from Tom Kelley came on a Tuesday afternoon in May. She remembered the day because she'd been sitting on her apartment floor going through her mail, which consisted entirely of overdue notices and a final eviction warning. Kelley's voice was professional, almost apologetic. He had a client who needed nude photographs for a calendar, something artistic, tasteful. The pay was $50 for 2 hours of work. She could hear in his tone that he expected her to say no, that respectable girls didn't do this kind of thing, that aspiring actresses especially couldn't risk it. But Norma Jeane wasn't thinking about risk. She was thinking about the eviction notice in her hand, and the empty refrigerator in her kitchenette, and the car she could no longer drive to auditions. She said yes before he'd finished explaining the details. They scheduled the session for that Thursday evening, after normal business hours when the building would be mostly empty. Kelley assured her that absolute discretion was guaranteed. The calendar would be printed with generic names, something like Miss Golden Dreams. Nobody would ever connect the anonymous nude model to Norma Jeane Dougherty, and certainly not to whatever Hollywood future she might still manage to salvage. Thursday arrived with oppressive heat, the air thick and still, the sky a flat white glare. She dressed in her simplest clothes, the cheap cotton dress that didn't matter if it wrinkled, no makeup beyond lipstick, her hair pulled back. Taking the bus to Northwestern Avenue, she thought about all the decisions that had led her to this moment. The foster homes, the early marriage to escape the foster system, the divorce that left her completely alone, the screen tests that went nowhere. The steady accumulation of rejection and disappointment that brought a person to the point where posing naked for $50 felt less like a choice and more like the only option remaining. When she arrived at Kelley's studio building, she stood outside for several minutes, smoking a cigarette, watching people walk past on the sidewalk, normal people with normal lives, who would never understand how a woman ended up here. Then she crushed the cigarette under her shoe and went inside because there was nowhere else to go. The studio was exactly what she expected. A converted warehouse space with high ceilings, photography equipment scattered around, backdrop rolls stacked against walls, the chemical smell of developing solution hanging in the air. Tom Kelley was waiting with his wife Natalie, which Norma Jeane appreciated. The presence of another woman made it feel slightly less sordid, more professional. Natalie had set up the background, a sweep of red velvet fabric arranged on the floor, studio lights positioned to create dramatic shadows. Kelley showed her some of his previous work, artistic nudes that had appeared in photography magazines, studies of light and form that elevated the human body to something sculptural. He explained what he was looking for: classical poses, nothing explicit, the kind of images that Renaissance painters would have created if they'd had cameras. When Norma Jeane finished her coffee, Natalie showed her to a small bathroom where she could undress. She hung her cotton dress on a hook, looked at herself in the mirror, and saw a woman who'd run out of choices. Then she wrapped herself in a robe Natalie had provided and walked back out to face the camera. The actual photography session existed in her memory as disconnected moments. The red velvet was softer than she expected, almost luxurious against her skin. The studio lights were hot, making her sweat within minutes. Kelley's voice giving gentle directions: turn this way, raise your arm, tilt your head, relax your shoulders. The mechanical click and whir of the camera shutter, over and over, capturing her from different angles. She'd modeled enough to know how to find her light, how to make her body do what the photographer needed, how to disconnect her mind from what her body was doing. She thought about the $50 and what it would buy. She thought about the audition she had next week for a small role in a low-budget film. She thought about whether she'd ever actually make it as an actress, or if this was all there would ever be: a series of increasingly desperate compromises, each one taking her further from the dream that had brought her to Hollywood. After 2 hours, Kelley announced they had everything they needed. She got dressed, signed a release form using the name Mona Monroe, and accepted an envelope containing two $20 bills and one 10. On the bus ride home, she felt neither shame nor pride, just a dull relief that she could pay her rent for another month and maybe survive long enough for something to change. The calendar appeared in early 1950, printed by Western Lithograph, distributed primarily through automotive supply stores, gas stations, and barber shops across the country. The title was Golden Dreams, and the model was credited simply as Miss Golden Dreams, 1949. It sold reasonably well in its intended markets, purchased mostly by men who hung it in garages and workshops, one calendar among thousands featuring anonymous attractive women. Nobody in the calendar's audience had any idea they were looking at a future Hollywood icon. Nobody connected Miss Golden Dreams to Norma Jane Dougherty, who by 1950 was slowly rebuilding her career under a new name, Marilyn Monroe. By 1951, she was landing small but noticeable roles. By early 1952, she was on the verge of genuine stardom, carefully managed by 20th Century Fox's publicity machine, marketed as a wholesome but sexy blonde who represented a new kind of American femininity. The calendar, meanwhile, continued its anonymous circulation, a minor piece of commercial erotica that nobody important noticed or cared about, until someone noticed, until someone cared very much. But what happened when that calendar surfaced would become one of the most pivotal moments in Hollywood scandal history. March 1952 arrived with Marilyn Monroe's career finally gaining momentum. She'd completed several films that showcased her unique combination of vulnerability and sexuality. Fan mail was arriving in increasing volumes. Magazine editors were requesting interviews and photoshoots. 20th Century Fox was preparing to loan her out for bigger roles, the kind that could transform a contract player into an actual star. The publicity department had crafted her image carefully. The orphan who made good, the sweet girl with the knockout figure, wholesome enough for family audiences but sexy enough to sell tickets. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned until someone at the studio received an anonymous envelope containing a tear sheet from the Golden Dreams calendar. The photograph was unmistakably Marilyn Monroe, the same face, the same body, the same distinctive beauty mark, and she was completely naked. The envelope included a note, handwritten, saying that unless the studio was interested in keeping this quiet, copies would be sent to every major newspaper in the country. It was classic Hollywood blackmail, the kind of thing that happened regularly in a system built on manufactured images and carefully concealed truths. But blackmail only worked if the target was willing to pay, willing to negotiate, willing to participate in the machinery of silence. What nobody expected was what Marilyn Monroe was about to do. The emergency meeting at 20th Century Fox involved Marilyn, her agent, studio publicity chief Harry Brand, and several executives summoned to manage what they all assumed would be a career-ending crisis. Brand explained the situation bluntly. Nude photographs had surfaced. Someone was threatening to leak them. The studio had limited options. The standard procedure was straightforward: deny everything. Claim the woman in the photos wasn't Marilyn, threaten legal action against anyone who published them, and if necessary, drop her contract to distance the studio from the scandal. This was how Hollywood protected itself. Ingrid Bergman was essentially exiled from American film for having a child out of wedlock. The message was always clear. The studio's reputation mattered more than any individual career. Actresses were replaceable. Scandals were not survivable. Marilyn listened to all of this, and then she did something that stunned everyone in the room. She refused to deny it. She refused to lie. She said the photographs were real. She'd posed for them when she was broke and desperate, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Harry Brand actually laughed, thinking she was joking. When he realized she was serious, his face went pale. An actress admitting to nude photographs, that was professional suicide. That was the end of everything. But Marilyn had a different calculation. She'd grown up with nothing, survived foster homes and predatory men, and an industry that treated women as disposable commodities. She understood something that the studio executives could never understand. When you came from nothing, you had nothing to lose. She'd watched how the publicity machine worked, how scandals were managed, how denials often made things worse because they gave the story legs, created mystery, turned a single embarrassing photograph into a prolonged investigation. She proposed something radical. Instead of denying the photographs or hiding from them, she would tell the truth completely and publicly in a way that controlled the narrative before the tabloids could shape it. She would give an interview explaining exactly why she'd posed nude, turning the scandal into a story about survival rather than shame. The executives thought this was insane. Harry Brand told her flatly that honesty would destroy her career faster than any lie. But Marilyn understood the audience in a way that studio executives never could. She knew that most people, especially women who read fan magazines and followed Hollywood gossip, had struggled with money at some point. She knew that vulnerability, presented correctly, could create connection rather than judgment. She was betting everything on the possibility that America would forgive a woman who admitted to being desperate rather than condemn her for being dishonest. The interview was arranged with Eileen Mosby, a United Press correspondent who covered Hollywood. Mosby was known for being tough but fair, exactly the kind of journalist who could help Marilyn control the story. They met at Marilyn's apartment rather than at the studio, a deliberate choice that made the setting more intimate, more human. Mosby arrived expecting standard damage control. Instead, Marilyn made coffee, sat down on her worn couch, and told the truth. She explained that in 1949 she was a struggling actress who couldn't pay her rent. She described being hungry, being broke, facing eviction. She talked about Tom Kelley's phone call and the $50 that meant the difference between surviving and being thrown out onto the street. She was clear that she wasn't proud of posing nude, but she also refused to express melodramatic shame. She framed it simply. She'd needed money. Someone offered work. She took it. The photographs were artistic, not pornographic. She'd signed using a false name because she hoped nobody would ever connect them to her, but now that they had been discovered, she wasn't going to lie about it. When the article appeared, it was titled "Marilyn Monroe Tells Why She Posed in the Nude," and it presented exactly what Marilyn had wanted, a story about survival and honesty rather than scandal and shame. The reaction was not what anyone expected. There was certainly controversy. Church groups condemned her. Some women's organizations called for boycotts. Conservative commentators wrote editorials about declining moral standards, but underneath the predictable outrage, something else was happening. Letters started arriving at 20th Century Fox by the hundreds, then thousands. Most of them were supportive. Women wrote to say they understood being broke and desperate. Men wrote to say they respected her honesty. The fan magazines, instead of turning on her, ran sympathetic stories about her difficult childhood and her struggle to make it in Hollywood. Hedda Hopper, the most powerful gossip columnist in Hollywood and a notorious destroyer of careers, wrote a column defending Marilyn, saying that a woman who admitted her mistakes showed more character than one who lied. Even more surprisingly, the scandal didn't hurt her career. If anything, it accelerated it. The controversy made her more famous, more discussed, more sought after. The photographs that were supposed to end her career instead made her more human, more relatable, more interesting. Casting directors who might have passed on her before were now eager to work with her because she'd become a household name. 20th Century Fox, recognizing that their gamble on letting her tell the truth had somehow paid off, began giving her better roles, bigger billing, more prominent placement in their publicity campaigns. What Marilyn Monroe accomplished in March 1952 was nothing less than a revolution in how Hollywood handled scandal. Before her, the protocol was rigid: deny, conceal, protect the image at all costs. After her, a new possibility emerged: selective honesty as a crisis management tool. She demonstrated that audiences were more forgiving than studios assumed, that vulnerability could create connection rather than destroying careers. Within months, other actresses facing various scandals began adopting similar strategies, admitting to past mistakes rather than constructing elaborate denials. Publicists started advising clients to get ahead of the story by controlling the narrative through carefully managed confessions. The entire machinery of Hollywood scandal management shifted because one desperate actress had gambled on the truth and won. But the victory was more complex than it appeared. Marilyn had turned a scandal into a triumph, but she'd also reinforced her image as the beautiful, vulnerable woman who needed protection. The nude calendar became part of her mythology, the orphan girl who posed naked to survive, which fit perfectly into the tragic narrative that Hollywood loved to construct around its blonde icons. She'd saved her career, but in doing so, she'd also locked herself into a role that would become increasingly difficult to escape. The calendar itself became one of the most reproduced images in American culture. The original Golden Dreams print, which had sold for a few dollars in gas stations, became a collector's item worth hundreds, then thousands of dollars. Reprints appeared in men's magazines. The photograph was analyzed and discussed and celebrated and condemned. Tom Kelley, the photographer who'd paid her $50, made far more from subsequent licensing deals than Marilyn ever received from the original session. The image followed her throughout her career, surfacing in new contexts, reinterpreted by each generation. In the 50s, it was scandalous. In the 60s, after her death, it became tragic. By the 21st century, it was simply part of the visual vocabulary of American popular culture, divorced from the desperate circumstances that created it. But for Marilyn herself, the calendar was never just an image. It was a reminder of the hungriest moment of her life, preserved on film, available for anyone to see. It was proof that she'd come from nothing and survived by any means necessary. In the months following the scandal, 20th Century Fox executives conducted their own analysis of what had happened and why their initial crisis management approach had failed. What they discovered forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between studios and audiences. The old system assumed that moviegoers wanted their stars to be perfect, untouchable, existing in a realm of glamour completely separate from ordinary life. But the audience of the early 50s was different. World War II had changed American culture fundamentally. People had experienced real hardship, real loss, real struggle. They were less interested in impossible perfection and more responsive to authentic humanity. Marilyn's willingness to admit she'd been broke and desperate resonated because millions of Americans had their own stories of hard times and difficult choices. This represented a seismic shift in how celebrity functioned in American culture. The studio system was losing its absolute control over star images because audiences no longer wanted or believed in that level of manufactured perfection. By 1953, Marilyn Monroe was a genuine star, appearing in major films, commanding significant salaries, recognized everywhere she went. The nude calendar was behind her in one sense. It was no longer a source of controversy, but it was also always with her, part of her public identity, referenced in every profile and biography. When she married Joe DiMaggio in 1954, newspapers ran the story alongside references to her troubled past. When she studied acting at the Actors Studio in New York, attempting to be taken seriously as an artist, critics brought up the calendar as evidence that she was only a sex symbol. When she died in 1962, obituaries mentioned the photographs as part of her complicated legacy. The image that should have ended her career before it began instead became inseparable from how she was remembered, a permanent reminder that beneath the Hollywood glamour was a woman who'd once been desperate enough to pose naked for $50. After Marilyn's death, the Golden Dreams calendar took on new significance as part of her mythology. Hugh Hefner, who'd launched Playboy magazine in 1953 with Marilyn as his first centerfold, purchased the crypt directly above hers at Westwood Memorial Park. The photograph appeared in countless retrospectives, documentaries, and exhibitions. Cultural historians used it to discuss the economics of the entertainment industry and the desperation that drove young women to make impossible choices. The photograph became larger than Marilyn herself, transformed into a symbol that could be interpreted in multiple, often contradictory ways, as evidence of exploitation, as a celebration of sexual liberation, as a tragic precursor to her eventual fate, as an example of survival and resilience. What's rarely discussed is what the photograph actually captured: a 23-year-old woman who was hungry and scared and running out of options. The red velvet and dramatic lighting couldn't completely obscure the desperation that brought her to Tom Kelley's studio that evening in May 1949. If you look closely at the image, past the manufactured glamour, you can see it in her eyes. Not shame exactly, but a kind of resignation, the expression of someone doing what needs to be done to survive. That vulnerability is part of what made the photograph so compelling then and so enduring now. It wasn't just a nude photo of a beautiful woman, it was a document of a particular kind of female experience, the experience of having your choices narrowed to the point where selling your image felt like the only path forward. Millions of women understood that experience even if they never posed for a camera. The $50 that Marilyn received for the session represents one of the most dramatically unequal transactions in the history of American popular culture. That modest payment bought Kelley the rights to an image that would be reproduced millions of times, generating enormous profits for publishers and collectors. It bought the studios the vulnerability they could market as part of Marilyn's persona. It bought journalists endless material for articles and retrospectives. And what did it buy Marilyn? Another month in a cheap apartment, groceries for a few weeks, a temporary reprieve from eviction. The photograph that would define her public image for the rest of her life was created for the price of survival, nothing more, nothing less. 70 years after that May evening in Tom Kelley's studio, the Golden Dreams calendar remains one of the most recognizable images in American visual culture. But the story behind the image, the story of a desperate young woman making an impossible choice, retains its power because that story never really ends. Every day young women arrive in Los Angeles with dreams of making it in entertainment, and every day some percentage of them discover that the city is exactly as brutal as it was in 1949. The specific economics have changed, the mechanisms of exploitation have evolved. But the fundamental dynamic remains, an industry that consumes vulnerable people and occasionally, almost accidentally, transforms a few of them into stars. Marilyn Monroe's trajectory from that nude modeling session to international stardom is presented as an inspirational story, but the darker truth is that her survival required not just talent and determination, but also an extraordinary willingness to be vulnerable in public, to perform her own desperation for an audience, to turn her most difficult moments into entertainment. The nude calendar scandal of 1952 changed how Hollywood managed celebrity crises, but it didn't change the underlying system that created those crises in the first place. What changed was that audiences now expected occasional glimpses behind the curtain, carefully managed revelations that created an illusion of authenticity. Marilyn had demonstrated that vulnerability could be valuable, so vulnerability became another commodity that studios learned to produce and market. Every contemporary celebrity who does an interview about their troubled past is in some sense following the template that Marilyn Monroe created in March 1952 when she decided to tell the truth about posing nude for $50. When Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, the Golden Dreams calendar was already a permanent part of American visual culture, but her death transformed it into something else, a relic, a memorial, a reminder of what Hollywood cost the woman at the center of all that manufactured glamour. She'd told the truth about posing nude, and America had forgiven her, but that forgiveness came with a price. She was forever the vulnerable blonde, the desperate girl who made good, the tragic figure whose early struggles explained and predicted her eventual fate. The $50 she received in 1949 bought her another month of survival. But the photograph that transaction produced would define her forever in ways that neither she nor Tom Kelley nor the executives at 20th Century Fox could possibly have predicted that evening when she hung her cheap cotton dress on a hook and lay down on red velvet because she had no other choice.